Hi everyone! In today's video I would like to share with you a couple of ideas on what flowers you can plant in your shady garden to attract more pollinators. And I would like to make a series of videos like this highlighting plants for different seasons. So in this video we are only going to talk about summer flowering plants. And all the plants I'm going to mention today are either perennial, so you can grow them in your container or real garden for many years, or biennial, so that means they live for 2 years, but you can easily grow them yourself from seeds. And although most pollinator-friendly plants prefer full sun location, there are still many options for those gardens that don't receive a lot of sunlight. So just as a quick reminder, we talk about shade when our garden receives less than 3 hours of direct sunlight, and then partial shade is between 3 and 6 hours of direct sunlight. So all the plants I'm going to mention today are suitable for either shade or partial shade or for both. Okay, so I'm gonna share with you a list of plants that I either grew or am growing right now in my own shady container garden. But just before we talk about those plants, there are two informations that I think are quite important and worth sharing before. Okay, the first thing I would like to say, and I think this is crucial, is that if you want to create a pollinator-friendly garden, you should avoid using pesticides, because pesticides, both organic and chemical pesticides, are non-selective, so they will kill both pests and beneficial insects and pollinators. So if you want to attract more pollinators in your garden, it can't be to endanger them even more. And I always say this, but a certain amount of pests needs to be tolerated in the garden, because pests are part of the food chain. You can't completely eliminate pests. So when things get out of control, there are many physical ways or many biological control methods, so using natural predators, that you can use to control that pest population in your garden. So these are non-harmful ways that will tackle only that specific pest without harming pollinators and beneficial insects. So think about this and always consider pesticides as your last option. Okay, and it's also interesting to know that bees don't pollinate plants deliberately. So we grow flowers for their ornamental features like different flower shapes and flower colors and patterns and scent, but all of those features have actually evolved to attract pollinators, to ensure that those pollinators, they transfer pollen from one plant to another and ensure that this plant can reproduce. So it's also important to realize that not every pollinator can pollinate every flower. Certain flowers have evolved in ways that they can only be pollinated by a specific pollinator or a specific group of pollinators. For example, snapdragons, we are going to talk about snapdragons in today's video, but they have evolved to be pollinated only by larger, heavier bees that can actually pull down the lip of the flower and be able to enter inside the flower. So this is just as a fun fact, and now let's finally talk about those plant ideas. Okay, so number 1 and 2 on my list are heucheras and tiarellas, and I sort of put them together because they have very similar characteristics in a way that they are both very winter hardy perennials. Heucheras are winter hardy down to zone 4 and tiarellas down to zone 3. And heucheras, they have evergreen leaves. And the truth is that we predominantly grow them for their foliage because they come in many beautiful leaf colors, but then in early summer they produce those tall spikes, tall bloom stalks with these very tiny, dainty, kind of bell-shaped flowers that often contrast beautifully with the foliage. And these flowers may seem so insignificant to a gardener, but they are magnets for pollinators. Over the years, I've seen all kinds of pollinators on my heucheras, smaller bees, larger bees, and even butterflies. And then tiarellas, they have a little bit more showy flowers, but they bloom for a really long time. And as you can see, they produce these very long spikes that are absolutely packed with very tiny white to pinkish flowers that look like little crowns. And similarly to heucheras, tiarellas also attract a whole bunch of different pollinators, bees and butterflies, but also hoverflies, which are very beneficial insects for your garden. Okay, and number 3 are foxgloves. I don't have any foxgloves this year, but I grew them pretty much every other year. And foxgloves are biennials, so that means they produce foliage in the first year and then they bloom in the second year. So we usually sow them midsummer, then we overwinter them as seedlings, and they are pretty winter hardy, and then they bloom the following year, sometime late spring, early summer. But there are hybrid varieties available that you can seed at the beginning of the year and then they bloom already in the first year. So foxgloves, they produce these very tall bloom stalks with tubular-shaped flowers that attract long-tongued bees, so different species of bumblebees. It's important to know that foxgloves are poisonous, so care must be taken, but nonetheless they are really great options for shady and partially shady gardens. They grow really well in full sun as well, and they do really well in containers. And traditional foxgloves are usually pretty tall. They grow anywhere between 1.2 to 1.5 meters tall. So if you only have a very small garden and the space is limited, you can opt for dwarf cultivars, for example Foxy Mix. Those foxgloves grow only to about 70 centimeters in height. Number 4 are snapdragons. Snapdragons do surprisingly well in shady gardens. In my garden, I think they receive about 3 hours of morning sunlight, and look at them go. I mean, they're a little bit beaten down by the wind. We had terrible wind yesterday, but I grew them from seeds and they started to bloom, I think, about a week ago. So there's still many more flowers to come. And I highly encourage you to grow them from seeds because you can get your hands on many more interesting varieties like these Lucky Lips, or Kimosi Apple Blossom is another snapdragon that I grow in my garden. That's a really dwarf variety. It only grows about 20 centimeters tall, which makes it perfect for smaller containers, for window sills, for tiny balcony gardens. And snapdragons, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, they can only be pollinated by larger bees, like bumblebees that are heavy enough to pull down the petals and to reach the center of the flower. And snapdragons, they are winter hardy down to zone 7, so in warmer climates you can overwinter them outside. In colder climates you will probably need to either seed them every year as annual flowers, or you can also take cuttings and overwinter those cuttings and then grow them on again next year. Okay, number 5 are hydrangeas, classic garden shrubs that do really well in shade and partial shade, especially Hydrangea macrophylla, Hydrangea arborescens, and Hydrangea serrata. But not every type of hydrangea is attractive to pollinators. So for example, if you take a look at your Hydrangea macrophylla, this is what we call inflorescence, and this inflorescence is full of sterile florets. And those more fertile florets, they are, first of all, there's not a lot of them, and then they are hidden in the center. So they are not easily accessible for pollinators compared to, for example, lace cap hydrangeas that have plenty of fertile florets that are exposed with an easy access to pollinators. So if you want to plant a hydrangea for pollinators, pick a mountain type hydrangea, so Hydrangea serrata, Hydrangea quercifolia, oak leaf hydrangea, or climbing hydrangea. Some Hydrangea paniculatas can also be attractive to pollinators, but not all. Only those that have a large amount of fertile florets. So some cultivars, so just to give you an example, would be Brussels lace, Big Ben, or confetti. Next are astilbes. Astilbes are fabulous plants for shady gardens. They are hardy down to zone 4 and they do really well in containers. They bloom over several weeks with these feathery kinda blooms that range in color from red, pink, purple and white. They also vary greatly in height, anywhere from 25 to 60 centimeters tall, and each flower plume consists of hundreds of very tiny and very densely packed flowers that open in succession. And they bloom usually between late spring and early summer, but different varieties may bloom at slightly different time. For example, here I have a variety called Milk and Honey with beautiful pink flowers that is just starting to bloom, and we're at the end of June. But I grew different varieties in the past with darker pink flowers that would bloom a little bit earlier, like for example sometime in May. So it might be a good idea, if the space allows, to grow different varieties to enjoy them over a longer period of time. So those feathery blooms will attract all kinds of pollinators to your shady garden, bees, butterflies and even moths. Okay, and last but not least are honeysuckles. Honeysuckles are really beautiful plants that are also very adaptable, And there are different types available that bloom at different times of the year. You can also find honeysuckles with evergreen foliage or with deciduous foliage, honeysuckles that grow more like shrubs, other more like climbers. And I grew a climbing honeysuckle many years ago in my garden, and it received about 3 hours of morning sunlight, and it did really well. So if your shady garden does receive at least a little bit of sunlight, I think you can also successfully grow honeysuckles in your own garden. So they produce these trumpet-shaped flowers that range in color from reds through oranges and pinks and yellows, creamy whites, and they are often sweetly scented in summer. And honeysuckle is hands down the best plant you can plant to attract a whole range of pollinators and beneficial insects. They will attract bees, butterflies, moths like elephant hawk moth, ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies. Everything is attracted by honeysuckle. And what's even better is that once those flowers are done blooming, they transform into berries that then will attract birds to your garden. Okay, so I hope that you found at least a couple of ideas on what you can plant in your shady container garden this summer to attract more pollinators. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate if you could give it a thumbs up. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see each other in the next one.